Таны төлөө эх орн чинь юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуухаас өмнө та өөрөө эх орныхон төлөө юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуу. Jan Fitzgerald. Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай нэвтрүүлэгт Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын элчин сайд Jonathan Addleton хүрэлцэн ирээд байна. Good evening.
Thank you.
Mr. Addleton.
Америкийн нэгдсэн улсаас Монгол улсад суугаа онц бөгөөд бүрэн ирэхэд элчин сайд Jonathan Addleton. Элчин сайд Jonathan Addleton нь 1984 оноос хойш Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын гадаад харилцаанд ажиллаж байсан туршлагатай ахлах ажилтнуудын нэг юм. Тэрээр өмнө нь Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын олон улсын хөгжлийн агентлагийн төлөөлөгчийн газрын захирлаар Пакистан, Камбож, Монгол зэрэг орнуудад тус ажиллаж байсан. Мөн түнчлэн Йордан, Казахстан, Өмнөд Африк болон Йеменд Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын олон улсын хөгжлийн агентлагийн хөтөлбөр хариуцсан ажилтнаар ажиллаж байв. Элчин сайд Addleton Дэлхийн банк, Macon, Телеграф, олон улсын инх тайвны төлөөх Карнегийн санд ажиллаж байсан туршлагатай юм. Тэрээр Төвцийн их сургуулийн хууль, гадаад харилцааны Флетчер сургуулиас магистр болон докторийн зэрэг, Нордвестерны их сургуулиас бакалаврын зэрэг тус хүртжээ.
You are ambassador of a great nation, our big friend, the United States of America, and I would like to thank you again very much for coming to this show, and I would like to ask you first to introduce yourself, where you were born, school, parents, and how come you became a diplomat.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I was actually born in Pakistan, but spent my college years back in the U.S. at Northwestern University outside Chicago, and later in Boston or outside Boston at Tufts University. I learned early on that I wanted to travel. I guess that accounts for being a diplomat. But I chose in the early part of my career to be with USAID, so served in a number of countries managing development programs. That included Pakistan, Yemen, South Africa, Cambodia, Kazakhstan, also Mongolia. And then last year I had the chance to return to Mongolia, this time of course as ambassador. It was a wonderful opportunity. My family loved immensely. Our first time around, we were here from 2001 to 2004. Now I've been back for about 10 months, and it's terrific to be back after, I guess, 6 years away.
You're welcome. You are serving in Mongolia second time, this time as ambassador, and we are very honored. Who made the major impact in your life, in your childhood, that you became or you wanted to be a diplomat, to be a people, to be one of the people who makes the world closer, friendly? Tell us, please.
Well, that's a good question, actually. I think like many people influenced by my parents, perhaps especially my father. My father was the 10th of 14 children, and was actually the first in his family to get a high school education and go on to college.
Out of 14 children?
14 children, yes.
Wow.
I think in that generation, in the 1930s, they had large families. He certainly had one.
How many you have now?
Three. And I think it's interesting because I think in that generation, things do change. But basically, his father was a tenant farmer in the countryside and later a carpenter on the railways. But my father had the opportunity to go to college and was interested and did have a deep influence on me, I think, in maybe more in emotional ways when it comes to tolerance and kindness and compassion, but also an international outlook. And then more in my professional career, I've been fortunate because I've served under some wonderful ambassadors, including someone called Ambassador Bill Burns, who I served with in Jordan. He subsequently was our ambassador to Russia and is now as Undersecretary for Political Affairs. In Pakistan, more recently, I served under Ambassador Crocker. And all along my career, of course, here in Mongolia, I served with Ambassador Dinger and Ambassador Slutz. So I've had great people to work with. And I think, again, I think family in some sense may be who I am. But I think professionally, the opportunity to have good mentors along the way made a big difference.
Is your wife here?
Indeed. We met, my wife is originally from Scotland, although she's now a U.S. national. But the first time around, we were here with 5 of us, Fiona, myself, and our 3 kids. Now our kids are old, our boys are older, but there's 3 of us here. My wife Fiona and our daughter Katrina is in 10th grade here in Ulaanbaatar.
10th grade.
10th grade, yes.
And she's a school.
She attends the international school.
Here.
Yes.
How about sons?
Well, my oldest son is actually in college in the U.S. and my second son is just finishing high school this year.
This year, so.
Yes.
Okay. We have been enjoying the friendship, the relations with your country for not that long time, a formal one.
Yes.
But informally, they were, according to one of the articles you wrote about, they were the first official mission was how many years ago?
Right. Now, a couple of things to say. The one that you're referring to actually was in 1920, when the first official U.S. diplomat came here. From Beijing. He worked in our embassy there at the time. In terms of formal relationship, of course, we've only had it for 23 years. I'm hoping I should be here to celebrate the 25th year in 2012. But you're right, 25 years is not a long time. But as you pointed out, in those early years, in the early 1900s, we had relationships. Interesting, that diplomat that came way back then in 1920, one of the quotations from his diplomatic report back to Washington was that he thought that the U.S., in his words, could be a most helpful factor in the development of a wonderful country. And I think that's a line that sort of struck off the page. Well, I hope he's right, and certainly it's a encouragement as I go about my work here, because obviously Mongolia has to make its choices for the future, but we, along with other partners, hope that we can be helpful.
And along with the vice president who had visited Mongolia early 60s?
You're talking, actually that was earlier than that. I think you're talking about, there's a couple interesting, if you don't mind the historical connections, way back in the late 1800s, actually, an engineer, Herbert Hoover, who later became our president, he was just a young guy at the time, but he visited what was then called Urga, and he talks about watching the Bogd Khan ride a bicycle around the courtyard in Gandan. But the vice president you're talking about is also quite interesting, because this was during the Second World War in 1944, and he was taking a trip through Siberia and did come down to Ulaanbaatar for 24, 36 hours. And was fascinated. Was fascinated by Asia, in fact. But probably, I mean, that was before we had diplomatic relations. But certainly, the earliest, first, very high-ranking American official to come would have been Henry Wallace back in 1944.
President Hoover.
He was a young engineer at the time, but about 20 or 25 years later, he became president.
So in that sense, we have a long history of relationship.
Well, I think there's interesting connections, and I was talking to you before. Even the American Dunge, which is in downtown, I think was the place where the American merchants back in the early 1900s. American Dinge. American Dinge, I think, as I understand it, was actually now it's an apartment complex near the Kempinski Hotel. But at that time, they had shops and traders that were, in some sense, advancing the commercial relationship between our two countries.
Since our diplomatic relations established formally in 1987.
Yes.
The first sign of that relations was the TV. We suddenly have started to see the Voice of America on TV, and there was at the time a C-SPAN program.
Okay, C-SPAN.
C-SPAN, yes.
Yes.
A C-SPAN program, which was first time aired to Mongolia.
Okay.
And by that time, during the communist time, we were forbidden to hear two radio. Mm-hmm. One was a Free Europe, the other was the Voice of America. And the Voice of America it's very hard to catch, but once you catch, you stay a bit there. It was the only voice and true picture that we were receiving about America. The rest was a lot skewed. So finally, communism is collapsed, and then we have this diplomatic relations, and now 23 years.
Yes.
During these 20 years, how many Mongolians have visited?
Well, in terms of ordinary American citizens, when I arrived actually in late November, I did ask my consular officer how many visas that we had issued from this embassy. And of course, the years roll on fast, and they told me it was approximately 50,000 visas to the United States for Mongolians in that 20-year history. I think the numbers have been increasing in recent years as well. I was mentioning also, which is, to me it's an interesting fact, is that this year our embassy at the start of the school year issued approximately 1,000 visas for Mongolians departing to the United States to study. Now, a small number of those are